From the KPFK studios in Southern California,
it's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. Hello, David. Top of the morning to you.
Top of the morning. I'm looking forward to today's oasis of sanity.
Yeah, we are an oasis of sanity, and one of the people who makes that saying is the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello, we want more than oasis of sanity. We want oasis of action in all congressional districts.
That's right. But today we are going to turn our attention to the state of America on both the foreign and domestic side. To do that, we've invited back on the show investigative journalist and foreign correspondent Allan Nairn. For most of his career, Allan Nairn has been literally risking his life to tell the truth about brutal regimes all over the world, particularly in Indonesia, Central America, and Haiti. In fact, in Indonesia, he was jailed for a time by the Suharto regime. So you know he must have been doing something right. He has a firsthand perspective on right-wing movements and is going to give us his take on how the Trump administration fits that paradigm. Also on the show, we welcome back Paul Hudson, who is the head of Flyers Rights, the nonprofit organization that advocates for airline travelers. If you fly a lot, or even a little, you don't want to miss this. I find it so hard to keep up with all the changes happening in the industry with bag fees, seat assignments, all the different ways the airlines keep lowering the bar and squeezing money out of their customers. He's going to give us the latest on all of that. And as always, we will check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber, covering the beat that very few in the media, mainstream or otherwise, cover. The corporate crime beat. But first, let's talk about the direction America seems to be heading and if there's anything we can do about it. David?
Allan Nairn is an award-winning investigative journalist. He has reported on death squads in Central America, mass killings in Indonesia, and brutal paramilitary activity in Haiti. He has been jailed. He has been beaten. He has risked his life to tell the stories of brutal regimes, many of which have been backed by the United States. He has seen on the ground the bloody effects of our policies. Noam Chomsky calls him one of the only true investigative journalists working today. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Allan Nairn.
Thanks. Good to be with you.
Not only is he a great investigative journalist, but if he ever debated Trump with Trump shouting, he'd take Trump to the cleaners because he has a very persistent way of analyzing domestic and foreign policy power grab. So welcome, Allan. I want to start very fundamentally here. There are a lot of indicators that show our already weakened democratic systems in our country are collapsing. You've got voter suppression after a civil rights movement in the 60s supposedly was going to head that off. Voter purges, all kinds of software and voting machines owned by corporations and controlled by them. All kinds of distractions in the mass media, all kinds of Wall Street taking over Washington and creating an ever deeper corporate state, which even libertarians call fascism. Libertarians call a corporate state statism, and they're as opposed to it as progressives. Let's start with the voters. Congress is the most powerful branch of government. It's also the smallest. It's also peopled by legislators whose names we know, 535 senators and representatives. What's wrong with 1% of the people organizing, reflecting a majority of the public, to turn domestic and foreign policy around and subordinate corporate and national security state power to we the people, which is the way the Constitution starts?
Well, organizing is what it will take. I think the point you made at the beginning about voter suppression, purges, is absolutely crucial, especially to the moment we're in right now. Right now, the thing to organize for is for the Democrats, as bad as many of them are, to take control of the House and take control of the Senate. It's a crucial turning point in American history. If that doesn't happen, if the Democrats don't take at least the House, and even if they fail to take the Senate, this country could turn in a direction that leads to the dismantling, not just of your life's work and that of so many other activists in every field, from civil rights to voting rights to just equal income distribution to anti-poverty to the environment to human rights to women's rights, a dismantling not just of all that progress and a rollback to where the United States was 100 years or more ago, but also a basic turn away from democracy, away from free speech, in the direction, in the kind of the uniquely American and uniquely modern neo-fascism that Trump and many around him have been promoting.
Allan, would you put it so far as saying the system is so degraded that the voters can elect their own dictatorship?
Yeah, well, that's the way many dictatorships come to power. Of course, Hitler is the most extreme and the most famous example. He got in through the electoral route. But in many countries, you have situations where you have rulers who have been elected who don't even need to impose a dictatorship, but who are able, through the use of the existing institutions, to create the kinds of terror that you usually associate with dictatorship. For example, in the Philippines, Duterte. American reporters will sometimes refer to Duterte as a dictator because he has presided over thousands, literally thousands, of assassinations of poor people in the poorest neighborhoods in the guise of an anti-drug program. He has terrorized and jailed political opponents, but he's not a dictator. He was freely elected. He won overwhelmingly in the elections. Until recently, he was doing very well in the polls in terms of his public approval ratings. He is using, not dismantling, the existing Philippine democratic institutions, but yet he's ruling with the kind of fear and oppression that we often associate with dictatorships.
Well, let's get back to the U.S. here. Is it fair to say that foreign policy in this country is dictated, that the people have almost no influence, that most of the civic groups, consumer, labor, environment, they work on domestic issues. They have virtually no impact foreign. The labor unions don't either. So let's carve out parts of our political economy. Let's start with foreign policy, which is about as lawless as it's ever been in American history. Both Obama and Trump have declared that they can violate any nation's sovereignty. Drone warfare, special forces going into over 100 countries last year, for example, military bases everywhere. No declarations of war. The Libyan overthrow, which spilled into Africa, enormous violence to this day and chaos. There was no declaration of war. That was Hillary's war, by the way, rubber stamped by Obama, opposed by Secretary of Defense Gates. And there was no appropriation of funds, no authorization of funds. It was a total criminal operation, the way the criminal invasion of Iraq was, with the loss of over 1 million Iraqi civilian lives and still huge chaos there. So is it fair to say that U.S. foreign policy is a dictator's policy under both parties, with almost no public influence to counter it? No judicial court influence, no congressional influence, and no civic influence back home?
I would say no regarding the American public, but yes regarding the world public. The United States is a kind of world government because U.S. forces feel free to intervene in any country in the world without the approval of the local populations, and certainly without the approval of the UN or being in compliance with international law or even being in compliance with the local murder laws. The people in Iraq, the people in Palestine, people in Guatemala, the people anywhere have absolutely no say in what the US chooses to do to their country. On the other hand, United States citizens do have potential power. It's less than they do on domestic fronts because, as you just enumerated, the US Congress has been giving away foreign policy making power to the White House systematically for decades now. And the president has more and more arbitrary power so that on whim, he can send a drone, he can set off a bomb, he can send US troops any country, anywhere he wants without congressional approval. But the key point is that US overseas intervention is so vast, is so complex, and it affects the lives of so many millions of people that a single president, a single White House staff can't really keep track of it all. There is so much going on that there are vast opportunities for Congress, acting in response to public pressure, to intervene and modify parts of U.S. foreign policy. So, for example, that's how in the 90s, after the Santa Cruz massacre in Dili, East Timor, which I happened to survive, activists here, I was one of them, we succeeded in organizing a grassroots movement that pressured Congress to, against the will of Bush Sr. and against the will of Clinton, start cutting off U.S. military aid to the armed forces of Indonesia, who had invaded the neighboring country of East Timor and killed a third of the population. And we actually succeeded in changing U.S. policy via Congress. And that contributed to the downfall of the dictator Suharto and the eventual independence of East Timor. Right now, there's a growing grassroots movement on the issue of Palestine, which has not yet succeeded in changing U.S. policy, but it has given birth to a trend within the Democratic Party where you have a number of congressional candidates, some with serious chances, now coming out and speaking up against actions like the Israeli military's systematic sniper assassination of the protesters in Gaza, which happens every Friday with almost no notice from the U.S. press. It's possible incrementally for people on the ground in the United States to affect foreign policy through grassroots activism. But what's happening in November with the election is not an incremental choice. It's not an incremental moment. The Democrats will either get control of one house of Congress or they won't. And if they don't, expect a mass increase in the level of U.S. overseas killing. Trump has already turned it up in Afghanistan, in Syria. He has increased the commitment to a U.S. overthrow of Venezuela. He has systematically expanded the budget of the Pentagon. He is following the Russian doctrine when it comes to the killing of civilians. He has adopted Bush Jr.'s and Obama's drone war and continued it, and given orders to commanders on the ground, don't worry about civilian casualties. It used to be when they were doing the drone strikes, they would have this bureaucratic process which would say, okay, if we do a drone strike, we'll tolerate 20 civilian casualties, 50, whatever the figure is. But beyond that, we'll call off the strike. Trump now sends orders to the Pentagon people and the CIA people on the ground. Don't worry about civilians, drone as many as you like. And as a result, there's been a massive increase in the number of civilian casualties in Iraq, in Syria, in North Africa, from U.S. drone strikes.
Alan, do you think if the Democratic Party made an issue of that, it would get them more votes in next month's election? Just briefly before we go on the next month's election subject.
I think it would. I think if the Democrats took stronger positions for justice, it would appeal to people. Look at the tricks that the Republicans are using. In the Cavanagh confirmation, here you had a man nominated to the Supreme Court who was accused of, at minimum, a sexual assault and arguably an attempted rape. And the narrative that they chose to present was, oh, this man is being treated unjustly. They saw that the basic issue of justice and fairness has enormous appeal to voters, and they're willing to lie ruthlessly to make a case that justice is being violated. Democrats are much more reluctant to argue on grounds of justice because they think it is somehow politically too risky. And a final point I would make is that when you were talking earlier about voter suppression, voter purges, this is absolutely fundamental to the situation we're in right now. Many polls indicate the Democrats are favored to take the House at this moment. I don't believe that. I believe at this moment it's a dead tie on the House side, and the Democrats have a small outside chance to take the Senate. I think the polls are probably wrong because they're not taking into account these voter suppression tactics, these voter purge tactics, the massive last-minute splurge of money that is going to come from the radical Republican right to smear Democratic candidates in district after district across the country. And even if there is a majority in a given congressional district that favors the Democratic candidate, that's not enough to win.
Actually, this is very true, listeners. This has happened again and again with the Republicans in the last few days or weeks of a campaign. And there are 6 million former felons who served their time who cannot vote in a variety of states, including Florida. There's a referendum in Florida to restore the right of people who served their time to begin to be able to vote. And in these close elections, as Allan pointed out, that can be a decisive flip into the Republican column. Let's assume that the Democrats over the last several decades have been less and less able to defend the Republic against the worst, most vicious, most Wall Street indentured, warmongering Republican Party in history. And let's look forward to next month. Now, I think there are three traps that the Democrats have already fallen into to lose next month. One is the massive focus on the Russian investigation of interfering in the election. The second is if we don't interfere in Russian elections or elections all over the world or topple over 50 regimes since World War II, from Iran to Guatemala. The second trap they've fallen into is the identity politics trap, where they focus very, very heavily again and again on the identity politics, which is important, but wait until you see the context. And the third trap they fall into is think they can run against Trump and win. Avoiding those traps is to make massive 1-month program for raising the minimum wages of 30 million workers that are making less today than they made in 1968, adjusted for inflation. The fact that Pelosi, Schumer, Tom Perez, who never returns my calls, of the Democratic National Committee, are not making this a major issue is an example of how they haven't learned from the years of Franklin Delano Roosevelt that the Democratic Party wins on economic issues, full Medicare for all, cracking down on abuses of consumers and the credit economy, defending tenants, affordable housing. You don't hear that. And they're falling into the trap which is going to fulfill your prediction. Because either they're not going to win the House and the Senate, or if they win the House, they're not going to win it by more than a few seats, and then they're beholden to the blue dog Democrats that are pretty bad and really crypto Republicans. What do you think they can do right now if you were advising the top Democratic Party politicos and you weren't urging people to vote for Green Party because of the reasons we know? What would you advise them to do right now? They got plenty of money. What would you advise them to do? The National Democratic Party.
Run on health care, run on wages, run on defending working people, run on defending poor people. I don't think has to be any contradiction between what's described as identity politics and class and justice politics. It's all part of the same battle. I agree that the Russia issue has been a massive diversion. It's basically been a political gift to the Republicans. MSNBC and CNN have done a huge disservice to American politics by wasting thousands of hours of airtime on a matter that's a lot of which is still speculation. I want to ask you, Ralph, you, like me, have been a fierce critic of the Democrats for decades and have been documenting the way that so many of them have adopted a corporate agenda over an agenda that favors working people and poor people and the environment and so on. But in this election, at this moment, with the threat of the rightist revolution from the Republicans, from the radical right looming, and the threat of Trump in the White House, what would you urge people to do? Would you urge people to go out now and organize for Democratic members of Congress and Senate candidates and vote for a Democrat, even if the particular candidate in question has not been very good on some of these issues?
Well, there are plenty good primary candidate winners at the Democratic Party level that should be supported, and including people who are challenging Ted Cruz like Beto O'Rourke and others. And I'm giving a lot of strategies for the Democrats to win. You can't get through. You can't get through other than to Congressman Jamie Raskin. You can't get through to anybody in the Congress, Pelosi, Schumer. I've known them for years. You can't get through the Democratic National Committee. I've given them great strategies. For example, midnight shift campaigning. There are millions of people who work the midnight shift. They never see a candidate. They carry the country while we're asleep. They're firefighters, police, they're nursing home workers, hospital workers, 7-Eleven workers, industrial workers. And I give them that. I tell them to develop a construct called American values and nail the Republican votes to each one of these that they're anti-American values. You can't even get them to accept it when you give it to them. When I was running as a Green Party candidate, I gave all these to both parties. They're not willing to accept it. It's still on votenator.org off the 2008 presidential campaign. These are majoritarian issues. We're not talking about UFOs here. We're talking about bread and butter issues where people live, work, and raise their families, whether they're Republican and Democrat. And the Democrats can shear off some of these blue-collar workers who went for the Reagan regime and have been voting Republican. So that's my contribution. And the way the Democrats are pursuing now is the following. They're trying to obstruct Bernie Sanders-type candidates. And they tried to obstruct them in the primary, just the way they obstructed Bernie Sanders in the presidential campaign in Nevada and Iowa and elsewhere. And number two, the old guard is still in power in the Democratic National Committee, and people like Pelosi, Steny Hoyer, and Chuck Schumer, who really bungled the Cavanagh nomination. So this is where we're at. You can't even have them save themselves. And so people have got to make demands on the Democrats that are winning demands. And if all they are concerned about is the stuff that's on CNN and so on, they're going to be seriously distracted.
Yes, I agree. Make those demands. And the day after Election Day, continue the effort to have the Democratic base take over the Democratic Party and expel the corporate and consultant class from power, from its current control of the Democratic Party. But at the same time, even if the Democratic Party does not take that very good advice you were just giving, even if the candidate, the Senate or congressional candidate in a given district is the one most closely aligned with corporate interests, I would say on this November 6th, you go and vote for that Democrat anyway, even though you fought them in the primary, even though you will fight them afterward, because this is a moment of absolute crisis for the future of American politics.
Whatever you do,
Absolutely.
You don't stay home. There was an article in the Washington Post recently where
Yes.
where some people said they're so disgusted with both parties they're going to stay home. Well, that's exactly what the plutocracy and oligarchy want you to do, is to stay home. That's why they don't want universal voting as a duty the way it is in Australia. What's your position on that, by the way?
Oh, I think universal voting would be a good idea. I think universal voter registration, that's something that the Republicans and the right fears, but it's not a panacea. Australia, with universal voting, has a right-wing government at this moment, and they just changed prime ministers, and they brought in a guy who is a mild version of a Trump-style leader. What's needed is first massive organization before Election Day, and then massive voting in the early voting, and on November 6th. This is a turning point moment. We already have minority rule in this country. We do not have anything resembling democracy. The Cavanagh agenda, which will now prevail on the Supreme Court, is opposed by a majority of Americans. The Senate that confirmed him for the seat is a Senate in which the Cavanagh-Trump position got a minority of the votes, yet it prevails because the system at this moment is structurally rigged in favor of the right. If the Republicans take both houses of Congress on November 6th, that structural rigging will increase radically. And as hard as it is now for the majority of the American public to have any say, not just in foreign policy, but in wage policy, in global warming policy, in equal rights policy, in any kind of policy, as hard as it is right now, it will get radically harder if the Republicans succeed on holding on to both houses of Congress. They have to be stopped, even if that means momentarily using the tool of what is still a deeply, deeply flawed and heavily corporate influenced Democratic Party.
Well, not only that, but they have the cover of the 5 corporate state judges on the Supreme Court. They have 5-4 majority now that will rubber stamp the corporate state, rubber stamp violations of civil liberty, criminal wars of aggression, massive government bailouts of Wall Street, and give more power to Trump and even block Congress. They'll even block Congress in that respect. You know, they have these 2 convenient doctrines, Allan Nairn. One is the courts say, oh, this invasion of Iraq without a declaration war, we don't have anything to do with that. It's a political question between the Congress and President George W. Bush. And the other technique they have is that people who challenge these criminal actions by the U.S. government have no standing to sue. So they're abdicating the judiciary's role here as a final arbiter under the Constitution. And the Congress is abdicating because they don't want the responsibility, and for decades they've been shifting power unconstitutionally to the White House. Let me pose a hypothetical. Somebody said to you right now, there's $100 million that can be spent on this November election. You can give it to the Democratic candidates, or you can put in the field 10,000 seasoned organizers in key districts and states in the United States. Which would you take?
I'd give it to the organizers and put them in the field in support of the Democratic candidates to prevent the consolidation of this neo-fascist minority rule. And the point you were just making about the Supreme Court, if the Republicans retain control of the Senate, there's a very good chance that that 5-4 rightist majority that you were just describing so well will become a 6-3 or maybe even a 7-2 Republican majority, a radical rightist majority. It has the potential to slip completely out of reach. And the same thing can happen in terms of complete dismantling of the Voting Rights Act, complete dismantling of the civil rights laws, further radical gerrymandering to put the House in the future out of reach, and I think a potential danger of a revival of the 1960s and 1970s style FBI tactics of attacks on domestic dissidents.
You don't think that the ruling plutocratic forces in this country have any self-restraint? Aren't they afraid they can push the envelope so far that they massively reduce consumer demand, tank the stock market, and develop the unpredictability that they so vigorously abhor?
I don't think they have much restraint, but who knows? And we shouldn't be dependent on that. We shouldn't be dependent on the whims of the American oligarchs. We should fight to reestablish majority rule. And that's really what this election is all about. The United States has minority rule now, and the rule of a privileged minority, and it's slipping toward a point of no return where...
let me interrupt you, Alan. Alan knows how fragile democracies are from his coverage all over the world. We don't have as fragile a democracy perhaps as some other countries, but we have a plenty fragile democracy that can be flipped. I mean, look what Trump and a handful of Wall Street forces advising him have done just so far. Look what's happened to the nomination process in the Supreme Court. I've proposed a Cavanagh watch, a small group of people who watchdog the 5 corporate statists on the Supreme Court and challenge their refusal to recuse themselves for conflicts of interest, challenge them for their decisions, publicize their decisions, and really recognize that they are a political group of jurists that provide plausibilities and casualties and the kind of smooth rhetoric in their decisions to cover up what they're really doing, which is implementing and enforcing the concentration of power in the country in fewer and fewer hands. Let me put another hypothetical in front of you. What if you had 10 million voters who are leaning Democratic?
Mm-hmm.
And they were asked the following question. Would you say to the Democratic candidates, we will vote for you only if you come out for a living wage and full Medicare for all? Or we will vote for you anyway because the Republican fascists are so much worse?
I would say you could try to threaten them. We will vote for you only if you come out for the living wage. But then even if they don't come out for the living wage, the situation is so dire that yes, you vote for them anyway, because the Republican fascists are that dangerous.
But you would want the challenge to come so that the vote for the Democratic Party is one that has some progressive pressure.
Oh, absolutely. I think the Democratic Party has to be, the leadership of the Democratic Party has to be essentially overthrown from within. And, it's worth noting that very surprisingly, at least to me, grassroots activists in the Democratic Party have come somewhat close to doing that in the fight for the leadership of the Democratic National Committee, in the fight for the leadership of the California Democratic Party, in the fight for party leadership in many other places across the country. You saw the Sanders forces over the past year and a half come fairly close, losing in many cases, but losing fairly narrowly. This suggests that it is possible. It is possible to take over the Democratic Party, to take it away from the corporate consultant class that runs it at this moment.
Actually,
Put
it's
it back
easier
on the
than
side
most
of
people.
majoritarian agenda.
Actually, it's easier than most people think if they start at the precinct
Yes.
level throughout the
It's
United
true.
States. That's what the
Absolutely.
right wing did to the Republican Party, the extreme right wing. They drove the liberal Republicans completely out of the party and took over with just a few 100,000 activists at the local level. I just looking through the transcript of your interview with Jeremy Scahill on the Intercept, and I just want to read one of your answers and have you elaborate. I think our listeners would be fascinated by this. And you answer this way. Well, what you just mentioned, and I'm quoting you. Well, what you just mentioned is a unique personal twist of Trump, and it actually relates to one of the reasons why he won the election. And that is that Trump essentially came out and said, look, the system is totally corrupt. I'm a crook. I've been part of this rigged system for years. I've been paying off the politicians. Now I'm going to be your crook. I'm going to be fighting on your side. People heard that. And it sounded a lot more credible to many people than Hillary saying, quote, oh no, the system is not rigged. The system is not corrupt, end quote. Those Wall Street contributions I take don't affect my decisions. She said that first to Bernie, then to Trump in the campaign. She said, quote, in fact, Obama took more Wall Street contributions than I did, end quote. People heard that and say, come on. They hear Trump say, quote, look, it's crooked. I'm a crook. I'm going to be your crook. And it sounds a little more plausible, end quote. Is that still going on? When are the Trump voters going to stop being flattered, fooled, and flummoxed by Trump?
Well, partly it's fooling people, but partly it's people seeing that, well, at least he's addressing an issue that I'm concerned about, even if he's lying about it, even if he's being a demagogue about it. In the last presidential campaign, in the primaries, there were only two candidates who acknowledged reality, who acknowledged the fact that the American middle class was collapsing, that in this country we had a massive crisis of economic opportunity. Those were Trump and Sanders. All the other candidates on both sides denied that it was happening. And all the other candidates refused to acknowledge the basic corruption of the political system, which had facilitated this collapse, which had allowed it to happen. Now, Trump and Sanders addressed that fact from two opposite angles. Trump said, yeah, the economic possibilities of the American working class have collapsed. How are we going to solve that? We're going to solve it with racism. We're going to solve it with a wall. We're going to solve it with scapegoating. Sanders took the opposite, more constructive approach. But in the end, when Trump was up against Clinton, you had one candidate who was at least addressing the reality and another candidate, Clinton, who was denying it, who was saying everything is okay. There's no collapse of the American middle class. And so some people, I think, maybe were naive enough to believe so many of Trump's lies. But others, I think, may have said, okay, he's a liar, he's a crook, but at least he's acknowledging that we got a problem. Well, the Democratic candidate is not even acknowledging that. And by this means, this monster, this racist, this effective neo-fascist was able to win the presidency with a minority of the votes because of the rigged structural nature of the American system. And as bad as that system was that helped bring Donald Trump into the White House, it will get unimaginably worse if the Republicans are able to retain control of both houses in the upcoming election.
Of course, Trump was not elected. He was selected. Hillary won the popular vote by millions of votes. He was selected by the Electoral College, which, by the way, is on the way to being neutralized by a citizen movement called NationalPopularVote.com, led by a San Francisco former entrepreneur, Steve Silberstein. He hired a half a dozen people. They went around, got laws passed from California to New York to Connecticut, saying that if enough states with 270 total electoral votes pass these laws, they will give the Electoral College vote to whoever wins the national presidential popular vote. So do you agree with me that it's easier than we think to turn this country around, starting with the grassroots take back of Congress?
Absolutely. So many crucial decisions are made in meetings that are open to the public, open to the members of a given party, where you only have a few hundred, even a few dozen people in the room. And if you can just organize a countervailing dozen more or 50 more to show up and get involved and push an agenda that represents the actual majority of the population you're supposed to be representing, you can win. It is much easier than you think, much easier than people think. You're absolutely right about that. And one of the successes of the American oligarchy, and with the complicity of the American press, has been convincing people that political power is inaccessible, that it just can't be reached, it can't be achieved, there's nothing you can do. Better to go home and do something else. Don't worry your heads about politics, but they're wrong. All it takes is really a marginal increase in the amount of activism, 20, 30, 40, 50% increase in the amount of people who are now spending hours a week fighting for some kind of justice, and you can win. You can turn this country around. I firmly believe that the long-term trend in this country, the long-term tendency, is toward the left, toward a more just, more open system where income is redistributed away from the oligarchs and back in the direction of the working people and the poor, because the American middle class has collapsed.
And the polls show this again and again on full Medicare for all, on cracking down on corporate crime, on labor union organizing and expansion, on consumer protection, on climate disruption, again and again. As pointed out in Michael Moore's interesting new movie, he gives some of those polls. You know, listeners, Allan Nairn knows what he's talking about. He was a one-person lobbyist on the U.S. policy toward Indonesia and East Timor on Congress, and he turned that around. He had some help, but he shows what one person can do.
These are complex matters on the one hand, but on the other hand, they're very simple. They're very simple. If a few more people, relatively speaking, get out and act, get out and organize people, and for this challenge of the moment, which is a challenge of the epoch simultaneously, and get people out in order to defeat the rightist revolution in November, to take away radical rightist revolutionary control of the Senate and the House, then a lot of things can start to change. That's only the beginning. That's only a first step, but it's a necessary first step. Because if this opportunity is lost, if the opportunity that this election presents is lost, the chance for real change will start slipping out of reach.
And if you don't vote in November, you're helping that very dangerous trend that Allan Nairn is describing. And by the way, Allan Nairn is talking from historical experience here. In my little book, Breaking Through Power, It's Easier Than We Think, I give a lot of examples of how change can occur with just a few people. Allan Nairn helped launch the challenge to the standardized testing racket in this country with a book he wrote called The Reign of ETS. That's the Educational Testing Service in New Jersey in 1980. And that started a whole critique, which is still ongoing. And more colleges are dropping the SAT as a requirement because it's a specialized form of fraud and doesn't really give full recognition of how students are going to perform in college. So thank you very much, Allan. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but we look forward to future interviews with you on important subjects that will challenge people's resiliency and self-respect and turn them into even greater civic advocates, taking only a tiny amount of their time week after week for the future of our country and posterity. Thank you, Allan.
Thanks, Ralph.
We've been speaking to investigative journalist Allan Nairn. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com, as well as the transcript from that Intercept interview. When we come back, we will talk to Paul Hudson, director of Flyers' Rights, the nonprofit organization that advocates for airline passengers. But first, we're going to take a short break and find out what's going on in the corporate crime world with our intrepid corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. You are listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Back after this.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, October 12, 2018. I'm Russell Mokhiber. Nippon Chemicon was sentenced to pay a $60 million criminal fine for its role in a conspiracy to fix the prices for electrolytic capacitors sold to consumers around the world. In addition to the $60 million criminal fine, Nippon Chemicon was also sentenced to a 5-year term of probation, during which the company must implement an effective compliance program and submit annual written reports on its compliance efforts. In May 2018, Nippon Chemicon pled guilty to conspiring with others to suppress and eliminate competition for electrolytic capacitors. The federal indictment charged the company with carrying out the conspiracy by agreeing with co-conspirators to fix prices of electrolytic capacitors during meetings and other communications. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Back in 2006, a real estate broker named Kate Haney was on a flight out of Austin, Texas, where she and her family and all of the other passengers were stranded on the tarmac without food, water, or communication for over 9 hours. She was so outraged by this, she started a petition and got such an overwhelming response, it resulted in the creation of a group called Flyers' Rights, which has been fighting for the rights of passengers ever since. Our next guest was a part of that fight that changed the tarmac policy and now heads this group. David?
I've been through that. It's unbelievable, the claustrophobia. Paul Hudson has been a groundbreaking public interest advocate for over 30 years. In the 1970s, in energy and utility policy. During the 1980s, for crime victims' rights. And during the 1990s through 2012, for air travelers and terrorist victims. He led the Pan Am 103 Lockerbie bombing victim family organization and the Aviation Consumer Action Project. Today, he is the president of Flyers' Rights. Please put your seat into an upright and locked position as we welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Paul Hudson.
Thank you very much for having me.
Welcome indeed, Paul Hudson. I mean, you're an example of how one person can make a tremendous difference and how it's easier than we think. But you're also an example of a consumer advocate that's had a very difficult time getting airline passengers around the country to support this small but very effective group called Flyers' Rights. So why don't you tell our listeners just some of what you and a very, very tiny number of other people have accomplished in Congress and on the FAA to make life better for people who climb onto airlines every day getting to their destination.
Well, thank you, Ralph. I guess the first thing that the organization did in 2009, it succeeded in getting what's called the 3-hour rule enacted. That meant that the airline could not keep you on the tarmac more than 3 hours without letting you out of the airplane if you wanted to go to the terminal or just go home or cancel your flight. We've also had a number of other victories in terms of getting the increase in baggage loss compensation. And most recently, our biggest issue is seats. As pretty much everyone knows, has been flying in the last 10 years, seats have been getting smaller and the average passenger is getting somewhat larger. In fact, a lot larger. And so 3 years ago, we filed a petition with the FAA to have some minimum seat standards. They rejected it. We went to court. The court more or less agreed with us. It went back to the agency. They rejected it again, and now Congress has enacted something requiring them to look at it again. So we're hopeful if we get some strong public support, we're going to see a reasonable accommodation for passengers. Not the way the airlines would like them to be, but the way what they are. Right now, anyone over 6'2" or 250 pounds, or if you're in the almost one-third category that's unfortunately rated obese, you simply cannot fit into these seats. There are health issues as well as comfort issues. We've worked on a number of other issues, but our overall approach is that of reasonable regulation and to encourage more robust competition, to get better service and to lower the cost of air travel. That was the promise of deregulation, but unfortunately it hasn't always worked out that way.
Well, the Congress says that the main concern of passengers who complain to their senators and representatives are these crazy fees that Delta, United, American, but not Southwest, put on people. $200 for a reservation change, for example, ever higher baggage fees for luggage, United is now charging for putting your luggage in the bin above your seat. And even though in most instances Southwest doesn't do that, don't you think that Southwest doesn't get enough credit? You see a lot of these reporters that they come down hard on American, United, Delta for doing these things, gouging passengers, but they don't have a couple of paragraphs say, well, Southwest doesn't do these things, and they're making money.
Yes, Southwest is kind of in a special niche. They, however, generally are not a carrier that flies outside the United States. They also have a system where you do not have a reserved seat, and that turns off some people. And there's a variety of other things. Southwest does not allow their fees, their ticket prices, to be advertised on the websites where most people book flights. So a lot of this is limiting it. But Southwest is quite profitable. Other airlines, however, have taken a completely different tack. They're following what has been done in other industries. I can think of banking, for instance. They used to make most of their money with interest. Now they make as much or more with fees. And the fee thing is allowed under the current law for a couple of reasons. One, there is no definition of what a ticket includes, no legal definition. So an airline could advertise a ticket price for $1 and everything else would be fees. Now, why would they do that? Well, they do that because it would give them a marketing advantage. They would come up as the cheapest one. But also, fees are tax exempt. There is no ticket tax applied to fees. So the airlines get a big increase in their bottom line for that reason as well.
Well, there's another bit of progress that Flyers Rights and Paul Hudson have succeeded in doing. They succeeded in getting the bumping compensation range doubled. It was formerly $200 to $400. It's now $400 to $800. This is when you got a confirmed reservation, you go up. And years ago, the airlines could just bump you. Say, the plane is full, too bad. And you say, but I have a confirmed reservation. Say, too bad, the plane is full. But they tried to do that with me once on a flight from Washington to Hartford, and I took it to the Supreme Court, and I won 9-0, and the Supreme Court ruled that there could be regulation of these. So now people who show up with confirmed tickets and they say the plane is full, the airlines have to, inside the plane, before the doors close, offer passengers to go on the next flight, and they can give them compensation. And now that compensation can go as high as $400 to $800, thanks to Paul Hudson and Flyers Rights. Paul, how can people find out more about Flyers Rights, to join, to support, to pay their dues, and get a huge return in terms of reducing some of the anxiety and some of the stress and the frustration and sometimes anger that airline passengers reflect because of the way they're treated?
The best way, Ralph, is to go on our website, www.flyersrights.org. That's FLYERS. And you can join the organization for a very modest amount. You can sign our online petitions. You can subscribe to our weekly newsletter. We're the only organization that puts out one weekly for flyers. We can also call, if you have a particular problem yourself with air travel, our hotline, which is free, 877-FLYERS-6, 877-FLYERS-6. We offer also, of course, advocacy, and you can advocate as a volunteer with our organization. We're primarily volunteer, but we also have very good staff, and that's how you can make a difference.
And I might say that Flyers Rights is nonprofit, and Paul Hudson has been subsidizing it with his own money. This is just the kind of honest consumer advocacy group that you want to support, listeners, and spread the word as well. In the recent legislation that Congress passed, the so-called FAA authorization bill, they did tell the Department of Transportation to do something about shrinking seat size and crushed knees, but they succumbed to the airline industry's lobby and didn't put in the regulation of these outrageous fees like $200 for a reservation change by Delta or other airlines. So what you're pushing for, Paul, is not only to get that regulated, but you've been pushing for an update of the Passenger Bill of Rights. You call it Passenger Bill of Rights 2.0. Do you want to describe that?
Yes, that's something that we developed in 2012. It consisted of about 30 proposals. It's now up to about 45. And we believe that that would fix the regulatory problems in air travel and make it much, much better. Unfortunately, all 535 members of Congress have declined to introduce it. And even the one thing you mentioned about seats, unfortunately, I hope I'm wrong, it may be a trick, because the way the legislation is worded, it asks the FAA to regulate seats based on safety. And that means to the FAA if you can get out of the airplane in emergency evacuation. And they have taken the position that the existing shrunken seats are safe. And in their last iteration back in July, they indicated that they could shrink seats even more and they would still perhaps find them safe.
This is one of the longest standing farces of the FAA. They ought to be more than ashamed of themselves. Tell them how they think passengers are able to evacuate the entire plane and how much time.
They have what's called the 90-second rule. This is based on experience of many air crashes where people survive the crash, but they die from smoke, fire, or water because they can't get out in time. And each airplane, before it can be put in service, has to pass what's called an emergency evacuation test. They have to get everyone out in 90 seconds in low light conditions with half the exits disabled. Now, this is a pretty tough test. And so in order to pass it, essentially what's happened is the manufacturers have fudged and faked. They have, in their test subjects, they eliminate 80% of the actual passenger profile. Anyone over 60 is eliminated. Children are eliminated. Overweight people are eliminated. Obese people are eliminated. Really tall people are eliminated. Anyone disabled is eliminated, and so forth and so on. And they also don't even do the full evacuation test anymore. They do computer simulations and some partial tests. And this farce has been going on for about 20 years now. And it's gotten so bad that even the Inspector General of the Department of Transportation is doing an investigation to see if they are actually valid tests.
You know, the FAA has long been a toady of the airlines and the airline manufacturers. There have been many documented books on this. But, you know, there is something people can do. The FAA puts out a list of airline passenger complaints, and if they go up on a particular airline like Delta or United or American, it's publicized all over the country. So the airlines are very sensitive to a surge of direct complaints to the FAA. So if you ever have a problem with an airline, do complain to the FAA. How would they complain to the FAA, Paul Hudson?
They complain to the DOT, which is the agency over the FAA. If you go on our website, we have a section called Know Your Rights, and that will explain exactly how to do it, or you can simply go on the DOT website. You should also send a complaint to us, because one of the things that keeps the statistics from not being worse is they hide the actual specifics of the complaints under personal privacy protection grounds. So if you send your complaint to a group like ours as well, it will get publicized in the particulars as well.
And your website again, slowly, before we ask Steve or David whether they have a question?
It's Flyers, FLYERSRIGHTS.org.
That's simple. FlyersRights.org. Use it, help it, and be part of it, especially if you fly. David, Steve, any question for Paul Hudson of Flyers Rights?
Airlines always present themselves to the American public as basket cases. Up until recently, they really never turned a profit. Is this the first time in modern aviation history that we're seeing airlines finally being profitable?
Yeah, there was a major turnaround starting in about 2010. American Airlines went bankrupt, and there was a major consolidations going on before that. So prior to that, we generally had 10 or 12 major airlines. Now we're down to 4 that control about 85% of domestic flights. We also have 3 joint ventures, they call them alliances, that control about 2/3 of the international flights. And these things, for the most part, have antitrust exemptions, which they can do things that would otherwise be illegal.
In conclusion, Paul, we're running out of time, but in conclusion, just to be fair, even though the big airlines have been pushing their envelope, like outsourcing maintenance to Central America or Asian countries with less, perhaps, regulation would occur in this country, they have a pretty good safety record in the last 25 years, haven't they?
They do. And, the safety was never deregulated. And that is the major reason I think we have a good safety. And the second reason is, perhaps nearly as good, the manufacturers have made planes safer and engines more reliable. And those two things together, I think, are primarily responsible for the excellent safety record we now enjoy.
Well, on that knock on wood note, thank you very much, Paul Hudson, who directs the nonprofit super effective group Flyers Rights, but it'll be even more effective if you contribute to it and send Flyers Rights your complaints. Just go to flyersrights.org. Thank you very much, Paul.
Thank you, Ralph.
Good job.
We've been speaking to Paul Hudson, president of Flyers Rights. We will link to Flyers Rights at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Well, that's our show. I want to thank our guest today, investigative journalist Allan Nairn and president of Flyers Rights, Paul Hudson. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the Wrap-Up. A transcript of this show will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio website.
For Ralph's weekly column, it's free. Go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com.
And laugh yourself serious with Ralph's new book, How the Rats Reformed the Congress. Check out the episode we did on it 2 weeks ago on how we need to organize in every congressional district. To acquire a copy, go to ratsreformcongress.org.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody, at the website ratsreformcongress.org. It also shows in great detail how you can organize a Congress watchdog group, have a lot of fun and a lot of justice, and prove to yourselves that it's easier than we think to take control of Congress and all the beneficial things that can come from that.
Hi, this is Jimmy Lee Wirt. Welcome to the wrap-up, where we save little odds and ends of the show that didn't fit into the radio version. We have 2 things for you today. First, Ralph asks Allan Nairn about what is going on politically in Brazil, and you'll find some eerie echoes of what is happening in America.
Alan, you've watched regimes change all over the world, and in late October, there's going to be a runoff in Brazil, one of the biggest economies in the world, in charge of the Amazon, between 2 candidates. Can you give us a quick summary of how important this election is?
Well, it's a very dangerous election. The Bolsonaro, the candidate of the radical right, who just came out ahead in the first round with 46% of the vote, is the favorite to win the runoff against the candidate of the Workers' Party, which is the party of Lula da Silva, the former president. And Bolsonaro is an open advocate of military dictatorship. He said the only thing wrong with the old military regimes was that they didn't kill enough dissidents. He's openly racist. He's openly against anyone who is not like him. But he won in important part on what he claimed was an anti-corruption platform. He claimed that he was running against the rot of the political system. Part of the reason that claim of his had credibility was because Lula, the old union leader and former president put into power by a massive vote for the Workers' Party, is at this moment in prison. Lula is at this moment in prison on corruption charges. The case that was brought against Lula looks like a selective prosecution. It looks like it was politically cooked up, as was the impeachment of the Workers' Party president before him, but it comes in the context of a massive national corruption scandal in which top members of the establishment have been proven to be stealing millions of dollars from the public treasury. Most of this theft has been done by the national elites identified with the extreme right wing of Brazilian politics. But it so happened that most of these prosecutions relate to crimes that happened under the Workers' Party government. And so Bolsonaro, a man of the right, whose own side is far more corrupt than the left has been, is able to present himself as an anti-corruption candidate. And there's a good chance that this man, who is much more openly fascistic than Trump, will become the next president of Brazil. And by the way, this apparently is being done without U.S. intervention. So often, when these kinds of military, and Bolsonaro is a former military man, military repressive far-right movements take power, it's done with overt or covert U.S. intervention. In this case, that's not really the story. It's happening as a result of the internal dynamics of Brazilian politics and the Brazilian class system. And one point it serves to make is that when you were pushing for social reform, when you're challenging the corrupt oligarchs and murderous militaries, you have to be cleaner than clean. You have to be purer than pure. People have to be able to look at your movement and say, they're the honest party. They're the ones who are fully against corruption. Because if they can tar you even a little bit, the radical right will use that ruthlessly. And that's what's happening in Brazil right now. And it's a lesson for activists in American politics, activists in the rising American left to keep in mind. You have to be the honest party, cleaner than clean, so that you don't leave yourself open to that kind of attack, which tragically may be now on the verge of succeeding in Brazil.
And isn't that the spread of street crime and desperate insecurity in the streets and poor areas in Rio and Sao Paulo and Recife? Isn't that a factor because he's coming on like law and order, right?
Well, there's an element of that, but as with Trump, most of what he and the radical right in Brazil says about crime is a lie. It's a massive exaggeration. In fact, under Lula and Dilma, his successor, there was huge success in transforming Brazilian society, in advancing the lot of the poor. They put in an anti-hunger grant program that dramatically reduced the rate of malnutrition in the poor favelas. They made the beginnings of a modest redistribution of income in Brazil. And they were even, in kind of a remarkable feat of political dexterity, able to do it without bringing on a coup that many Wall Street elements were wishing for at the beginning when the Workers' Party first came to power. But they have stumbled on the corruption issue, and now all of Brazil may be about to pay the price.
And loathe the poor Amazon and indigenous peoples there, and that means loathe the poor world in terms of climate disruption.
Yes, he wants to abolish the environmental agency. Bolsonaro, the rightist candidate, wants to abolish the environmental agency that is trying to restrain the agribusiness landowners who are trying to cut down the Amazon for their own corporate interests.
Any predictions on the outcome before we conclude?
Well, he's got a very good chance of winning. He came close to winning in the first round.
Thank you very much on that note, Allan Nairn. One thing is sure, which you don't have to predict. Bolsonaro wins. The first person to congratulate him will be Donald Trump in the White House.
Yes.
You agree?
Absolutely. He's his kind of guy.
Thank you again, Allan Nairn.
And now Steve has an additional question for Paul Hudson, president of Flyers Rights.
Paul, my question, do you do much watchdogging of the TSA? Because to me, that seems where a lot of the inconvenience and conflict of flying comes in. I was on a cross-country flight yesterday, and I was going out of Newark. There were some weather issues. There were a lot of flight delays, and there was a very long line at United to go through TSA, and they must have sensed this. I was not TSA pre-check or anything like that, but all of a sudden, they were letting everybody through. You didn't have to take your shoes off. You didn't have to take your computer out of your bag or your belts off or anything like that. Is this just the illusion of security, or is it real security?
Well, the TSA, we've been a frequent critic of it. By the way, on our Bill of Rights for airline passengers, we have a whole section on the TSA. Right now, we believe that they have a number of things that they really need to do to make themselves more acceptable to the public, as well as to improve the effectiveness of security. We have one formal rulemaking petition, which they have kept under wraps. They don't want to release it, but it involves a prohibition on carrying ammo and guns at the same time in your checked luggage, because that was used in Fort Lauderdale in January of last year to do a mass shooting. And the reason for this is very, very ridiculous. But because of the pro-gun administration and the fear of many people to do anything that would be considered anti-gun, that has not been acted on. We also have advocated for easily returning property that gets confiscated at the screening stations. Instead, they either throw it away or they just put it in their pockets. We also have been against some of the intrusive pat-downs and searches, particularly of elderly, women in certain areas. And we've also been an advocate for a more transparent way for people to get off the watch list and even the no-fly list, which involves several 100,000 people right now. And it's been quite a while since 9/11, and it's about time we had some due process for that.
And that's a wrap. Be sure to tune in next week to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too